Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop reacting emotionally, a narcissist seems to become desperate, not angry at first, not loud, desperate? Most people believe narcissists fear confrontation, but psychology tells a different story. They don't fear conflict itself, they fear losing control. And the one person most capable of exposing that hidden fear is not the strongest person in the room. It's the super empath. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating psychological dynamics in human behavior. What really happens when a super empath challenges a narcissist the right way? And the answer may completely change how you think about emotional strength. Let's begin. Most people misunderstand what a super empath actually is. They imagine someone endlessly kind, endlessly forgiving, endlessly patient. That's only half the story. A super empath possesses extraordinary emotional intelligence. They naturally recognize emotions, patterns, inconsistencies, and unspoken intentions. They often give people multiple chances because they genuinely hope others can change. Ironically, this makes them attractive targets for narcissists. In the beginning, narcissists often mistake empathy for weakness. Psychologists have long recognized that highly empathetic individuals are more likely to prioritize harmony, making them vulnerable to manipulation if healthy boundaries are absent. Imagine standing in front of someone who has spent years learning exactly which words make people cry, apologize, doubt themselves, or lose control. They expect another emotional reaction because that reaction has always given them power, but this time, something is different. You remain calm. You don't raise your voice. You don't rush to defend yourself. In that single moment, the balance of power quietly begins to change. Many people believe strength looks loud. Psychology suggests something more surprising. Emotional self-regulation, the ability to manage your reactions under stress, is consistently associated with better decision-making, healthier relationships, and greater psychological resilience. The strongest person in the room is often the one whose emotions are under their own control, not under someone else's control. This is where the idea of the super empath begins, not as someone with supernatural abilities, but as someone who has learned an extraordinary psychological skill. They still feel deeply, they still care deeply, but they no longer confuse kindness with surrender. They understand that compassion without boundaries can become an invitation for manipulation. Here's what makes this so fascinating. Individuals who rely on manipulation often expect predictable emotional responses. They anticipate guilt when they criticize you. They anticipate fear when they threaten to leave. They anticipate confusion when they contradict themselves. These expectations are built from repeated experiences. Behavioral psychology has shown that behaviors producing desired outcomes are more likely to be repeated. If emotional manipulation has worked before, it becomes a habit. But habits collapse when the expected reward disappears. Picture a gambler pulling the lever of a slot machine that suddenly stops paying out. At first, they don't walk away. They pull harder. They try again. They become frustrated. Human behavior often intensifies before it changes when familiar rewards disappear. The same pattern can appear in unhealthy relationship dynamics. When emotional manipulation no longer gets the reaction it once did, the manipulative person may temporarily increase their efforts in an attempt to regain control. This doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It often means the old pattern is no longer working. And that can be deeply unsettling for someone who has depended on controlling emotional outcomes. The remarkable part is that your greatest weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's emotional stability. Research in psychology has repeatedly found that people who pause before reacting are generally more capable of making thoughtful decisions instead of impulsive ones. When emotions run high, the brain can shift toward rapid, automatic responses. Giving yourself even a brief moment before responding allows more deliberate thinking to guide your actions instead of immediate emotional impulses. Think about what this means in real life. Someone insults your character. The old version of you might have rushed to defend yourself. The calm version simply asks, is responding actually going to improve this situation? That single pause changes everything. Because silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is evidence that your emotions belong to you. This is why emotional control can feel so confusing to someone expecting emotional chaos. They may interpret your calmness as indifference. In reality, it often reflects discipline. You are no longer allowing another person's behavior to determine your emotional state. Many people misunderstand empathy itself. Empathy does not require absorbing another person's dysfunction. Feeling compassion for someone's struggles does not require accepting harmful treatment. Healthy empathy includes recognizing another person's pain while also recognizing your own worth. This distinction matters because chronic emotional stress has real effects on the body. Research has linked prolonged psychological stress with disrupted sleep, elevated stress hormones, impaired concentration, and increased risk of anxiety and depression. Living in constant emotional conflict isn't just exhausting, it can gradually affect both mental and physical well-being. Imagine carrying that invisible burden every day. Your heart races before every conversation. Your stomach tightens every time your phone vibrates. You rehearse explanations before you've even been accused of anything. Your nervous system remains on constant alert. Eventually, your body begins treating everyday interactions like emergencies. No one deserves to live that way. The super empath reaches a turning point when they recognize that protecting their own emotional health is not selfish. It is necessary. They stop believing they must earn respect through endless patience. They stop believing every misunderstanding must be corrected. Most importantly, they stop believing another person's approval determines their value. That realization changes every future interaction. Instead of asking, "How do I make them understand me?" they begin asking, "Why am I working so hard to convince someone who has no interest in understanding me?" The difference between those two questions is life-changing. One keeps you trapped. The other opens the door to freedom. Interestingly, studies on emotional intelligence consistently suggest that people with stronger emotional awareness tend to recognize their own feelings more accurately while responding more effectively to interpersonal conflict. Emotional intelligence isn't about suppressing emotions. It's about understanding them well enough that they don't make every decision for you. This explains why calm confidence often feels so powerful. It cannot be manipulated as easily. A manipulative person often expects urgency, immediate apologies, immediate explanations, immediate emotional reactions. But emotional maturity slows the entire process down. It creates space between feeling and reacting. Inside that space lives wisdom. Inside that space lives self-respect. Inside that space lives freedom. And perhaps the greatest surprise is that remaining calm doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care enough about yourself to protect your peace. Imagine two people standing in the same storm. One fights every gust of wind until complete exhaustion. The other plants their feet, accepts that the storm exists, and refuses to be blown wherever the wind demands. The storm may be identical. Their response is completely different. That response determines who remains standing. The super empath understands one profound truth that changes everything. Emotional reactions are choices that can be strengthened with practice. Every time you choose calm over chaos, your confidence grows. Every time you refuse to argue with deliberate manipulation, your self-respect grows. Every time you honor your boundaries, your emotional resilience grows stronger. Over time, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing difficult people, not because they become less manipulative, because they become less powerful over your inner world. That is genuine freedom. Real strength has never been about winning every argument. It has never been about proving someone wrong. It has never been about getting the final word. Real strength is waking up each morning knowing your peace no longer depends on someone else. Behavior. And when you reach that point, something extraordinary happens. The person who once believed they controlled your emotions discovers they no longer control your attention. Your calm becomes your message. Your boundaries become your voice. Your silence becomes your confidence. And without shouting a single word, you demonstrate the greatest psychological victory of all. You no longer need another person to validate your worth, because the strongest challenge you can ever present to manipulation is becoming someone whose emotional life is no longer controlled by anyone else. What if the greatest source of a manipulative person's power isn't their intelligence, their charm, or even their confidence? What if it's something much simpler, your emotional reaction? Every time your heart races, every time you rush to explain yourself, every time you lose sleep replaying an argument in your mind, an invisible psychological cycle may be strengthening. The most unsettling truth is that this cycle often survives not because manipulation is unbeatable, but because human emotions are remarkably predictable. Imagine a person who has learned through years of experience that a single accusation makes you apologize, a silent treatment makes you panic, and a cold stare makes you question your own memory. From their perspective, these are not random events. They are patterns, and the human brain is exceptionally good at learning patterns that consistently produce results. Behavioral psychology has demonstrated a simple but powerful principle. Behaviors that are rewarded are more likely to be repeated. This concept, known as reinforcement, shapes habits in everyday life. It explains why we repeat actions that bring us attention, success, or desired outcomes. The same principle can also help explain why emotionally manipulative behaviors may continue if they repeatedly achieve their intended effect. Think about that for a moment. Every emotional outburst, every desperate explanation, every tear, every anxious text, every attempt to convince someone determined not to understand you. If these reactions repeatedly give another person attention, reassurance, or influence over your emotional state, the unhealthy pattern can become deeply established. Not because you are weak, because your brain is responding exactly as human brains often do under emotional pressure. This is why manipulation can feel so confusing. It rarely begins with cruelty. It often begins with affection, admiration, or intense emotional connection. Your nervous system learns to associate that person with emotional highs and emotional lows. Over time, the uncertainty itself can become psychologically consuming. Researchers have found that unpredictable rewards can create especially persistent patterns of behavior. In relationships, cycles of affection, followed by withdrawal, may keep someone emotionally invested, always hoping the warmth will return. The uncertainty becomes part of the attachment. That uncertainty is exhausting. Your body starts preparing for emotional danger before anything has even happened. Your heartbeat changes when you hear their name. Your stomach tightens when you see a notification. Your thoughts begin rehearsing conversations that haven't even occurred. Stress is no longer occasional. It becomes your normal. Science has repeatedly linked chronic psychological stress with elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, reduced concentration, weakened immune function, and increased risk of anxiety and depression. Emotional manipulation doesn't simply affect your mood. Over time, it can influence your entire body. Think about how extraordinary that is. Someone else's behavior can eventually affect your heartbeat, your sleep, your memory, your energy, your health. This is why protecting your emotional responses is not simply about relationships. It's about survival. Now here's the psychological twist very few people recognize. Manipulation usually depends on prediction. The manipulative person believes they already know what you'll do. If they criticize you, you'll defend yourself. If they ignore you, you'll chase them. If they accuse you, you'll explain. If they blame you, you'll apologize. Their confidence doesn't necessarily come from being right. It comes from expecting your reaction. But what happens when the reaction never arrives? Something remarkable begins to unfold. The prediction fails. The psychological script breaks. The familiar pattern suddenly disappears. Imagine an actor walking onto a stage expecting everyone to say their lines exactly as rehearsed. Instead, silence. The entire performance stops making sense. That's often what happens when emotional manipulation no longer receives its expected response. This doesn't necessarily mean the unhealthy behavior immediately ends. In fact, psychology has observed that when previously rewarded behaviors stop producing results, there can be a temporary increase in intensity before they eventually decline. This is sometimes called an extinction burst. In everyday language, when manipulation stops working, it may briefly become louder, the criticism becomes sharper, the guilt becomes heavier, the emotional pressure increases. Why? Because the old strategy has worked before. The person assumes they simply need more of it. More anger, more blame, more emotional pressure. They're trying to restart a system that no longer functions. This is the moment many people accidentally return to old habits. They mistake the increased pressure as proof they should surrender. In reality, it may be evidence that the unhealthy pattern is being disrupted. Now consider the super empath. From the outside, nothing dramatic appears to happen. They don't scream. They don't insult. They don't seek revenge. Instead, they breathe. They observe. They think. They respond carefully, or sometimes not at all. That calmness isn't passive. It's profoundly active. Neuroscience suggests that taking a pause before reacting gives the brain greater opportunity to engage systems involved in reasoning and self-control rather than relying solely on automatic emotional responses. This brief delay can dramatically change the outcome of difficult interactions. One breath, one pause, one moment of awareness. Those tiny decisions can interrupt an emotional cycle that may have existed for years. That is extraordinary, because freedom rarely begins with one giant decision. It begins with hundreds of small ones. One calm response, one healthy boundary, one refusal to argue unnecessarily, one decision not to explain yourself for the 10th time. Each choice weakens the invisible chain connecting manipulation to emotional reward. Eventually, something surprising happens. The manipulative behavior loses its efficiency, not because the other person suddenly changes, because you changed. The reward disappeared. Imagine trying to start a fire after removing all the oxygen. The spark may still exist, but it cannot become the same destructive blaze. Your emotional reaction was never the cause of someone else's unhealthy behavior, but it may have been the fuel that unintentionally kept the cycle alive. Removing that fuel changes everything. There is another powerful truth hidden beneath all of this. Many people spend years trying to change someone else's personality. They study every conversation, every mistake, every apology, every argument. They believe if they finally discover the perfect words, everything will improve. Psychology offers a different lesson. The one person whose behavior you can reliably change is yourself. And strangely enough, that is often the change with the greatest impact. When your boundaries become consistent, people notice. When your emotional reactions become intentional, people notice. When your peace becomes non-negotiable, people notice. Some people respect the change, others resist it. But either way, the dynamic is no longer the same. Perhaps the most powerful realization is this. You do not reclaim your life by controlling another person's emotions. You reclaim it by protecting your own. That is the true difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is immediate. Response is intentional. Reaction is driven by emotion alone. Response is guided by awareness. Reaction gives your emotional steering wheel to someone else. Response keeps your hands firmly on it. And that single distinction may determine whether manipulation continues for years or quietly comes to an end. Because in the end, emotional manipulation survives only as long as it continues producing the result it was designed to create. The moment your peace becomes stronger than your impulse to react, the entire psychological equation begins to change. And when someone discovers they can no longer control your emotions, they face something they never expected. A person who has finally realized that true power is not found in winning emotional battles. It is found in refusing to let someone else decide how your mind, your body, and your future will feel. There comes a moment in every emotionally exhausting relationship when a single question quietly changes everything. It isn't, how do I make this person love me? It isn't, how do I prove I'm right? And it certainly isn't, how do I finally win this argument? The question is far more powerful. What if protecting my peace is more important than protecting this relationship? That question marks the beginning of a transformation that psychology has long recognized as one of the healthiest shifts a person can make. For many people, boundaries feel uncomfortable because they have been taught that saying no is selfish. They believe kindness means endless availability, endless forgiveness, and endless emotional sacrifice. But research in psychology consistently shows that healthy boundaries are not barriers to love. They are essential ingredients of healthy relationships. Without boundaries, empathy can become emotional exhaustion. Without boundaries, compassion can slowly become self-neglect. Imagine trying to fill someone else's cup while your own is slowly running empty. At first, you barely notice. You smile through the fatigue. You tell yourself tomorrow will be easier. You convince yourself that if you just give a little more, explain a little better, forgive one more time, everything will finally change. But tomorrow arrives, and nothing changes. Except you. Your sleep becomes lighter, your mind becomes louder, your confidence becomes quieter. Science has repeatedly shown that chronic emotional stress can influence nearly every major system in the body. Long-term activation of the body's least stress response has been associated with increased cortisol levels, disturbed sleep, elevated blood pressure, weakened immune function, impaired memory, anxiety, and depression. Emotional suffering is not simply in your head. Your brain and your body are constantly communicating, and prolonged emotional distress can affect both. Think about that for a moment. The argument ended yesterday, but your body is still fighting it today. Your heart races over a simple text message. Your stomach tightens before a conversation even begins. Your shoulders remain tense long after the conflict has ended. The danger may be gone, but your nervous system hasn't received the message. This is why boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of protection. They tell your mind and body that safety matters. They remind your nervous system that not every emotional battle deserves your participation. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotionally strong people is that they never feel pain. In reality, emotionally resilient individuals often feel pain just as deeply as everyone else. The difference is what they do next. Instead of allowing pain to dictate every decision, they acknowledge it, learn from it, and choose actions that align with their long-term well-being. That distinction changes lives. A person without boundaries often asks, "How can I make this conflict disappear?" A person with healthy boundaries asks, "What response best protects my peace?" Those are not the same question. One sacrifices the future for temporary relief. The other builds a healthier future, even if today's decision feels difficult. Psychologists who study emotional regulation have found that people who respond intentionally rather than impulsively often experience healthier relationships and greater psychological resilience over time. Emotional maturity is not measured by how little you feel. It is measured by how wisely you respond to what you feel. Imagine standing in front of someone determined to provoke you. They expect anger. They expect tears. They expect endless explanations. Instead, you remain calm. You state your boundary clearly. "I won't continue this conversation if I'm being insulted." Then you follow through. No dramatic speech, no emotional performance, no desperate attempt to convince them, just consistency. That consistency is more powerful than most people realize. Why? Because boundaries without action are merely wishes. A boundary only becomes real when your behavior supports it. This is one reason manipulative people often test limits repeatedly. They are not only listening to your words, they are observing your actions. If every boundary eventually disappears under pressure, they learn that persistence works. But when your actions consistently match your words, the psychological landscape changes. The message becomes unmistakable. Your peace is no longer negotiable. There is another remarkable truth about boundaries. They do something many people never expect. They reveal who respects you. Healthy individuals may not always like your boundaries, but they usually learn to respect them. Manipulative individuals often experience boundaries as obstacles because boundaries reduce opportunities for control. The boundary itself doesn't create the problem, it simply exposes it. Think of a lighthouse standing against powerful waves. The lighthouse does not stop the storm. It simply refuses to move because of it. Your values can become that lighthouse. Calm, steady, reliable, unaffected by every passing emotional storm. This doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. There will still be guilt. There will still be doubt. There will still be moments when you wonder whether protecting yourself makes you a bad person. Those thoughts are common, especially for deeply empathetic individuals. But remember this: feeling guilty does not necessarily mean you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt simply reflects that you are doing something unfamiliar. Growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering. Research into habit formation suggests that repeated behaviors gradually become more automatic over time. The same principle applies to boundaries. The first boundary may feel terrifying, the second feels awkward, the 10th begins to feel natural. Eventually, self-respect becomes less of a decision and more of a lifestyle. Imagine what happens inside your mind during that transformation. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop rehearsing imaginary arguments before going to sleep. You stop apologizing for things that were never your responsibility. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's approval. Slowly, your mind becomes quieter, your breathing becomes slower, your confidence becomes stronger. Not because life became perfect, because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. Many people spend years believing love requires unlimited sacrifice. Healthy psychology tells a different story. The strongest relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, personal responsibility, and healthy boundaries. Love that demands the destruction of your emotional well-being is not evidence of deeper commitment. It is evidence that something important needs to change. Perhaps the greatest lesson a super empath eventually learns is this: empathy without self-respect is incomplete. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. Forgiveness without wisdom becomes repetition. Real emotional strength is not found in enduring endless pain. It is found in recognizing when pain is teaching you to choose differently, one quiet decision at a time, one healthy boundary at a time, one peaceful response at a time. Eventually you discover something extraordinary. You are no longer waking up each morning wondering how to keep someone else happy. You are waking up asking how to remain true to yourself. That single shift changes every relationship that follows. Because once you learn to protect your peace, you stop confusing chaos with passion. You stop confusing control with love. You stop confusing emotional exhaustion with loyalty. Instead, you begin choosing relationships where respect flows in both directions, where kindness is mutual, where honesty replaces manipulation, and where your nervous system no longer mistakes constant stress for normal life. In the end, the greatest victory of a super empath is not that they change a manipulative person. It is that they finally stop sacrificing their own mental health in the hope of changing someone who never wanted to change. And when that day arrives, something incredible happens. Your boundaries stop feeling like walls. They become the foundation upon which your confidence, your peace, your health, and your future are finally built. That is the moment you discover that the strongest act of love you will ever offer the world begins with refusing to abandon yourself.